It was the summer of 1944, deep in the heart of rural Georgia, where rows of pine trees lined the edges of a newly built U.S. Army prisoner of war camp. The war in Europe still raged on. But here, thousands of miles from the front lines, hundreds of captured German soldiers awoke each morning to a world they could hardly believe existed. Inside the mess hall, the smell of butter and frying batter filled the air, warm, sweet, and unmistakably American. Long wooden tables were neatly set, sunlight pouring through the high windows onto stacks of round, golden pancakes. The sound of metal trays clattering, the murmur of German voices, and the distant hum of a radio playing swing music painted a scene that felt almost unreal for men who, just months before, had been fighting for the Third Reich. For most of these prisoners, breakfast in wartime Europe had meant dry bread, thin coffee and rationed jam, if any at all. But now, under the supervision of American guards, they were served hot meals every morning. When a young soldier at the table pointed at the fluffy pancakes and smirked, calling them Kinderessen, food for children, others laughed with him. But as they tasted them, soft, buttery, sweetened with a drizzle of syrup, the laughter faded. In that moment, surrounded by the ordinary kindness of a former enemy, something subtle shifted. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They were human beings tasting normalcy again, perhaps for the first time in years. In the first months of captivity, the world felt smaller, quieter, and uncertain for the German prisoners who had been captured in Europe and brought to the United States. Many of them were soldiers from North Africa and Italy, men who had fought under Rommel's Afrika Korps or on the crumbling fronts of Sicily and France. When they were told they would be shipped across the Atlantic, they imagined grim prison compounds, hard labor, and hunger. Few could imagine a land where the air smelled of pine and soil, where trains ran on time, and where even the guards greeted them without hate. Yet that is what they found when the trucks rolled into the American POW camp in rural Georgia. For the first few days, everything felt like a blur: registration, delossing, uniforms replaced with khaki work clothes, and rows of barracks lined neatly beneath the trees. The men were given cots, blankets, soap, and clean drinking water. They were treated with efficiency, not cruelty. Still, there was distrust in their eyes. They had been told that Americans were ruthless, that capture meant humiliation. They expected insults or rough treatment. Instead, the guards offered cigarettes and told them when meals would be served. The discipline was firm, but it lacked the cold, mechanical harshness they had known in the German army. The first morning in the camp introduced them to something even more strange: the smell. It drifted across the yard before dawn, warm, heavy, sweet. Some thought it was bread, others guessed porridge. When the bell rang for breakfast, the line formed quietly, boots crunching over gravel, steam already rising from the mess hall chimney. Inside, the prisoners saw long wooden tables and rows of tin trays stacked beside metal pitchers. American cooks, some soldiers, some local civilians, moved in steady rhythm behind the serving counter. Their faces were calm, unreadable. The prisoners whispered among themselves, not knowing what to expect. The trays that were handed to them contained three things: scrambled eggs, a small slab of butter, and a stack of soft, golden brown discs, pancakes. Most of the Germans had never seen anything quite like them. To their eyes, the food looked childish, flat, spongy, and far too light to be real sustenance. One of the younger soldiers, a tall man from Bremen, smirked and muttered, "Kinderessen, food for children." The men around him chuckled. They looked at the pancakes, then at each other, as if this was some kind of joke. Surely the Americans didn't eat this every day. Surely this was some display meant to mock them. But as they sat down, the laughter began to fade. The smell of the butter, the faint sweetness of the batter, and the golden sheen of the syrup left on nearby plates drew curious glances. A corporal sitting near the window picked up his fork and took a cautious bite. He chewed slowly. His face froze. Then, almost in disbelief, he took another bite, bigger this time. The others watched, waiting for his reaction. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and muttered quietly, "Mein Gott, es ist gut." My God, it's good. The table fell silent. One by one, the men began to eat. The initial skepticism turned into quiet focus. The sound of forks scraping tin plates, the clink of metal cups. No one spoke for several minutes. There was something profoundly unfamiliar about the taste. It was not rich or complex, but it was comforting. It filled them in a way that went beyond hunger. For men who had been living on hard bread and watery soup through months of combat, this food tasted like peace. The American cooks noticed the change. They didn't comment or smile, but there was a shared understanding. Many of those cooks were veterans too. They had seen battle in North Africa or Italy before being reassigned to kitchen duty. They knew these German prisoners were just soldiers like them. Young, exhausted, and far from home. The rule was clear: prisoners received the same meals as American soldiers, no more and no less. The Geneva Convention required it, and the US military enforced it strictly. But what the regulations didn't capture was the quiet humanity of the act. The small mercy found in a hot meal served without malice. Over the weeks that followed, the routine became familiar. At dawn, the bugle sounded. The prisoners assembled, counted, and marched to the mess hall. The cooks worked quickly, flipping pancakes on large griddles, stacking them high. The air filled with the same sweet scent every morning, mingled with the aroma of coffee and the faint tang of fried bacon prepared for the guards. It became part of the camp's rhythm, something the Germans could rely on, an island of order in a world that had fallen apart. Still, there were undercurrents of disbelief. Some prisoners whispered that this hospitality was a facade, that the Americans were fattening them for labor. Others believed it was psychological warfare, to make them soft. But the days passed and nothing cruel happened. The work details were fair. The guards were firm but respectful, and every meal was consistent. Slowly, suspicion began to erode. There were moments when the smallest details struck them most deeply. One morning, as they sat eating in silence, sunlight streamed through the high windows and reflected off the syrup pooled on their plates. It glowed amber, like liquid gold. A few men paused, watching it shimmer as if hypnotized. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they were seeing beauty in something simple. One of them whispered that the color reminded him of honey from his father's farm near Hamburg. Another said the smell reminded him of his mother's kitchen before the war. Memories they had buried under years of duty began to surface. Warm kitchens, laughter, the smell of bread, the voices of children. For a moment, they weren't prisoners. They were simply men remembering home. There was something profoundly disarming about this realization. In the world they had left behind, the enemy was faceless, monstrous, something to be defeated. But in America, that image began to crumble. The guards didn't shout slurs. The cooks didn't serve rotten food. The officers enforced discipline, but they also enforced fairness. It was confusing, even unsettling. How could the people they had been told were decadent and weak show such order and compassion? Letters home reflected this confusion. Many of the German POWs were allowed to write censored correspondence back to their families. Some described the strange civility of their captors. Others confessed a reluctant respect. A few even mentioned the food. One wrote that American breakfasts were like a feast every morning, and another said, "I have eaten things here that our people have forgotten exist." These words, humble as they were, carried the weight of revelation. The laughter that once filled the mess hall had changed its tone. At first, it had been mocking, skeptical, an expression of superiority meant to disguise fear. But gradually, laughter returned in a lighter, more genuine way. It came from shared jokes, from small acts of camaraderie among men who were beginning to understand that survival did not have to mean bitterness. The American officers observed these changes with quiet approval. They knew that order came not just from discipline, but from dignity. By treating the prisoners as men rather than monsters, they reduced tension, prevented violence, and preserved morale on both sides. It was a practical policy, but it was also a moral one. The camp's commandant once remarked in his report, "When a man has eaten well, he remembers he is human." That statement, though written in a formal report, captured something profound about the psychology of captivity. The German soldiers who laughed at the pancakes had expected punishment. Instead, they received proof that compassion could exist even amid war. Each meal served as a quiet lesson, not in ideology but in decency. As weeks turned into months, the pancakes became more than food. They became a symbol of something these men could not fully articulate. A sense that the world they had been told to hate might not be as cruel as they had imagined. For some, that realization would linger long after the war ended. Years later, former POWs who returned to Germany would recall those mornings in America. Some would tell their families that the first time they felt truly safe after surrendering was when they tasted those pancakes. In the end, it wasn't about sweetness or flavor. It was about what the act represented, the deliberate choice to feed one's enemy with dignity. The Americans could have rationed them poorly, punished them with scarcity, or stripped them of humanity. Instead, they offered warmth. That warmth became part of the memory that outlived the war. And for those who experienced it firsthand, the scent of butter and batter would forever remind them of a truth discovered in captivity. That decency, when extended even to one's foes, can be more powerful than any weapon. The first time an American cook placed a metal pitcher of syrup at the end of the serving counter, the reaction from the German prisoners was almost comical. The men stared at it as though it were a trick. The syrup was thick, dark amber, glistening under the dim lights of the mess hall. It moved slowly when poured, like liquid glass. To soldiers who had spent years surviving on ration bread and black coffee so weak it tasted of water, such sweetness was inconceivable. The Americans didn't say anything. They simply filled each tray with pancakes, scrambled eggs, and a small pat of butter. The syrup sat at the end, waiting for anyone curious or brave enough to use it. Most didn't. The first few mornings, the pitcher remained almost untouched. A few of the younger prisoners looked at it and laughed, nudging each other with mocking grins. "That's for children," one said under his breath, echoing the sentiment many shared. Americans eat sugar for breakfast. No wonder they are soft. But behind the humor, there was an undercurrent of unease. They had grown up on stories of decadent America. a place obsessed with comfort and pleasure. And yet, these same people had captured them, fed them, and treated them with an unexpected civility. The contrast gnawed at their pride. The next morning, a few of them noticed something different. One of the cooks, a middle-aged man with a tanned face and rolled-up sleeves, smiled faintly as he poured syrup over his own plate before beginning his meal. He wasn't showing off, he simply ate in silence, methodically. Something about that image, an American soldier eating the same food, in the same way, broke the invisible wall of defiance that had lingered in the prisoners' minds. It wasn't a trap. This was just breakfast. A young private named Ernst was the first to try. He had grown up in Cologne, where sugar had become almost mythical by 1944. His family had lived through bombings, rationing, and endless queues for food. He remembered his mother trading fabric for a small jar of honey once. Years earlier, the smell of sweetness had filled their small kitchen for an hour before it was gone. Now, as he held the syrup pitcher, that memory surfaced with startling clarity. His hands trembled slightly as he poured. The syrup landed on the pancakes in slow, heavy drops, spreading like amber through the ridges of the warm batter. The first bite was cautious. His jaw tightened instinctively, expecting bitterness or strangeness. Instead, the flavor that met his tongue was soft, rich, and comforting in a way he hadn't felt since before the war. The sweetness wasn't overwhelming. It was delicate, balanced by the butter and the mild salt of the pancakes. He took another bite, slower this time. Across the table, a few of his comrades were watching. One leaned over. "Gut?" he asked, half mocking. Ernst hesitated, then smiled faintly. "J.R." he whispered. Gut, that simple word carried across the table like a quiet signal. Forks clinked. The syrup pitcher began to make its rounds. Within minutes, the smell of butter and sugar filled the mess hall, mingling with the sound of low murmurs and cautious laughter. A few men shook their heads in disbelief. One of the older sergeants, who had fought in North Africa, stared at his plate for a long time before finally eating. When he did, he set his fork down carefully, swallowed, and said, "This is the first sweet thing I've tasted since Tunis." The effect was more than physical. For men whose lives had been stripped of comfort, that small act of tasting sweetness again reopened something within them, something almost forgotten. It reminded them of their own kitchens, their mothers, their wives, their children. One soldier said the syrup smelled like the apple jam his grandmother used to make in Bavaria. Another said it reminded him of warm bread after Sunday church. The camp, with its fences and guards, momentarily faded away. In that small space, over those plates, they were transported home. The American guards noticed the change, though they said little. They weren't sentimental about it, but they could see the tension easing. The Germans still stood at attention during roll call, still worked on the assigned tasks, cutting timber, repairing fences, tending fields, but something had softened in their demeanor. They smiled more. They greeted the guards politely. Some even began learning English words. Thank you, good morning, coffee. For men who had lived through fire and ruin, politeness was not weakness, it was relief. One of the guards, a young man from Kansas named Robert, once asked an older cook why they went to such trouble for the prisoners. "Why pancakes?" he said one morning while stacking trays. The cook shrugged. "Because they're simple," he replied. "And because they remind you that you're home." Robert thought about that for a long time. By late autumn, the syrup had become a quiet symbol of transformation. It wasn't mandatory. No one forced the prisoners to take it. But most of them did. The taste of sweetness had become a ritual, a way to begin the day with something that felt human. In their letters home, they wrote cautiously about it, careful not to seem disloyal. "The food is good," one wrote. "We even have warm breakfasts." Another said, "The Americans serve strange flat cakes, sweet but not unpleasant." Between the lines there was gratitude, though few admitted it openly. When the Red Cross visited the camp in early 1945, they found morale surprisingly high. Reports noted that discipline was strong, health was good, and relations between guards and prisoners were stable. No mention was made of pancakes or syrup, yet those small details carried more meaning than any official statistic. They represented a quiet defiance of the brutality that had defined so much of the war. One morning, just before Christmas, the camp was covered in frost. The air was sharp, and the ground crunched beneath boots as the men filed into the mess hall. Inside, it was warm. Steam rose from the griddles, and the familiar smell of pancakes filled the air once again. Someone, perhaps one of the cooks, had managed to play faint music on a radio. A few notes of White Christmas drifted across the room, and for a fleeting moment the prisoners fell silent. Some closed their eyes, others stared down at their trays. None spoke. They simply listened. Ernst sat near the back that morning, staring at his plate. He realized that he hadn't laughed at breakfast in months. There was nothing funny about it anymore. The pancakes were no longer a novelty. They were something sacred in their simplicity. He poured the syrup carefully, almost reverently. Watching it flow like liquid amber around him, the camp seemed to fade into quiet reflection. The war still raged overseas, but here, in this small corner of Georgia, time stood still. The sweetness of that syrup had become a kind of bridge, a way of remembering that there was still gentleness in the world. It didn't erase what had happened or what was still happening in Europe, but it created a pause, a reminder that life could taste of something other than fear. When the war finally ended and the news of Germany's surrender reached the camp, the prisoners didn't cheer. They sat quietly, many with their heads bowed. Some wept softly, others stared into the distance. They didn't yet know what awaited them back home. Ruins, hunger, uncertainty. But they knew that they would never forget this place. Not because of luxury, not because of freedom, but because of what it had taught them about dignity. Months later, when repatriation began, the same men who had once mocked American food now stood in line for one last breakfast before boarding the transport trucks. The cooks served pancakes as usual. There was laughter that morning, but it was different, gentler, warmer. Some prisoners shook hands with the guards. Others left small carvings or letters of thanks. Ernst lingered at the counter before leaving. He extended his hand to the cook, who had served him hundreds of meals. "Thank you," he said quietly, in broken English. The cook nodded once. "You take care, son." As the trucks rolled away, the smell of butter and syrup still hung in the air, mingling with the dust. Many of the men turned back for one last look at the camp. It was, in its own way, the strangest memory they would take with them from the war. Not the battles, not the surrender, but the mornings when they sat quietly with their former enemies and tasted sweetness together. Years later, when historians interviewed former German POWs who had been held in America, several mentioned the food. One man, captured in Italy in 1943, recalled the pancakes vividly. "We laughed the first time," he said, "but when we tasted them we understood something. The Americans weren't like what we had been told. They had enough to share, even with their enemies. Another said simply, "It was the first time I felt human again." These were not dramatic revelations, they were quiet ones, found in moments of ordinary grace. The syrup, the pancakes, the soft warmth of the mess hall, all these became part of a memory that survived long after uniforms were folded away. And perhaps that is why such small acts endure. Because in the middle of a war that tried to erase compassion, something as simple as a sweet breakfast proved that humanity could still find its way through. As the seasons changed, the rhythms of the camp became as steady as the rising and setting of the sun. For both the American guards and the German prisoners, routine became a kind of quiet refuge from the chaos of the outside world. Each morning began the same way, boots on gravel, the sharp sound of the roll call whistle, and then the long, slow walk to the mess hall where the smell of butter and batter already drifted through the crisp air. At first, those mornings had felt like an extension of captivity, structured, monotonous, predictable. But as the weeks turned to months, something within that repetition began to soften. The guards grew familiar with the faces of the men they watched over. They knew who walked with a limp, who carried himself with the posture of an officer, who always smiled at breakfast. The prisoners, in turn, learned the routines of the Americans. Their jokes, their expressions, even the way they whistled tunes while serving food. It wasn't friendship. It was something quieter, something rooted in recognition. The pancake breakfasts became the center of that subtle transformation. No one planned it. No one even spoke of it. It simply happened day after day. As food was served and eaten, and small exchanges passed between those who once faced each other across battlefields. A word of thanks here, a polite nod there, little gestures that eroded the invisible wall between enemy and author. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The news filtered into the camp slowly. Rumors, headlines passed between guards, radio reports caught in fragments. The prisoners heard that cities they once called home were gone. Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg, reduced to rubble. For many, the thought of returning to that devastation was harder to bear than captivity itself. And yet life inside the camp went on. The fields needed tending, the fences repairing, the kitchen cleaning. The pancakes were still served every morning. It was during those late months of the war that the breakfasts began to take on an almost sacred quality. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew it. The act of sitting together each morning, of eating something warm, of existing in a world momentarily free from hatred, became a ritual of survival. It wasn't just nourishment, it was restoration. Some mornings, the laughter in the mess hall came easily. The German soldiers, many of them no older than 20, joked about the food, about the weather, even about the Americans' strange slang. The guards, in turn, began to relax. They stopped standing stiffly by the walls and started leaning casually against the door frames, watching the men eat. Occasionally, one of them would join the prisoners at a table. It wasn't officially allowed, but the officers often looked the other way. By that point, discipline had become less about punishment and more about trust. A private from Bavaria named Otto once described it years later. We stopped feeling like prisoners. We were still behind fences, but the fences stopped meaning the same thing. That change was most visible in the mornings. You could see it in the way men lingered after finishing their meals, cups of coffee cooling slowly as they talked. The guards would clear their throats when it was time to leave. but even they hesitated sometimes, as if reluctant to break the peace. There was something deeply human about those shared silences. Outside the camp, the war continued to grind forward with all its cruelty and destruction. But inside, in that wooden hall filled with the scent of pancakes and coffee, the brutality seemed to pause. The men, German and American alike, were part of a small, temporary world that existed apart from ideology. It was a fragile world built on routine, decency, and the strange neutrality of breakfast. Some mornings, when sunlight streamed through the high windows, the mess hall almost glowed. Dust motes danced in the light. The air shimmered faintly with heat from the griddles, and for a brief moment, it was easy to forget the barbed wire just outside. A few of the older prisoners took to saying a quiet grace before eating, not out of religion necessarily, but as a gesture of gratitude. The guards never interrupted them. They simply waited, respectfully, until the meal began. There was one morning, near the end of spring, when the mood in the camp felt different. News had spread overnight that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. When the prisoners entered the mess hall that day, there was no noise, no laughter. The usual scrape of chairs and chatter had been replaced by silence. The Americans stood at attention by the walls, uncertain of what to say. Many of them were just as young as the men they guarded, and though victory had been declared, it didn't feel like celebration. It felt heavy, solemn. The cooks served pancakes as usual, though slower than normal. The smell filled the hall, but it carried a weight it had never had before. When the prisoners sat down, no one touched their food for a long while. Some stared at their plates, others at the window where the morning light spilled across the floor. The war that had defined their lives was over, and none of them knew what came next. Home was far away, and what remained of it was uncertain. It was one of the guards, Robert, the young man from Kansas, who broke the silence. He cleared his throat and said quietly, "You can eat. It's all right." His voice wasn't commanding, it was gentle. Slowly, one by one, the prisoners began to move. Forks scraped plates again, the first bites tentative. Then, gradually, the familiar sounds of breakfast returned. A murmur of voices, a few half-hearted smiles. By the time the meal was over, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't joy, but it was release, a quiet acknowledgement that, for the first time in years, they were no longer soldiers in a war. They were simply men having breakfast together. One of the German officers, a stoic man in his 40s, stood up before leaving. He turned to the cooks and the guards and said, in careful English, "Thank you. You have treated us with honor." Then he saluted, not as a prisoner, but as an equal. The gesture was brief, but everyone in the hall felt its weight. After that day, something subtle but profound happened. The pancake breakfasts didn't stop, but their meaning shifted. They were no longer part of a wartime system of regulation. They became something closer to farewell. As repatriation plans began, the prisoners grew quieter. They ate slower, taking in the details they had once ignored. The texture of the wooden tables, the way the sunlight hit the syrup, the sound of coffee being poured. Every sense recorded the experience, as if trying to preserve it. When the first group was scheduled to leave, the cooks prepared an extra batch of pancakes, larger than usual. There was laughter that morning, real laughter. The kind that comes from relief and gratitude. The guards joined in, joking lightly as they handed out plates. One even poured syrup for a prisoner, who smiled and said, "Danke," without hesitation. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had dissolved entirely. A few hours later, the trucks arrived to take the men away. The prisoners filed out, carrying their few belongings, their boots clean and their uniforms pressed. Before boarding, many turned back toward the mess hall one last time. The air was still warm with the scent of breakfast. Some lifted their hands in farewell. Others said nothing, but their eyes said enough. In the years after the war, many of those men returned to Germany and tried to rebuild their lives. Cities were ruins, families scattered, the future uncertain. Yet among the letters, diaries, and interviews collected decades later, one detail appeared again and again: the breakfasts. Former POWs wrote about the American pancakes with surprising emotion. They described them as the taste of decency, the moment I stopped hating, and the first time I remembered life could be kind. One man, a former sergeant named Kloss, told a historian that those breakfasts had changed him. They showed me that humanity can exist even when everything else is destroyed, he said. The Americans didn't feed us to make us like them. They fed us because it was right. That is something I will never forget. Stories like his were echoed by many others. The shared meals had done what propaganda and politics could not. They had reminded men on both sides that decency was possible, even between enemies. The pancakes were never meant to be symbolic, yet they became exactly that, a symbol of quiet reconciliation, of the kind of peace that begins not in treaties, but in small acts of kindness. Years later, when some of those former prisoners emigrated to America, they brought the memory with them. A few even opened bakeries or cafes, serving pancakes on their menus, smiling as they told curious customers about how they first tasted them as POWs. To them, it wasn't just food. It was the flavor of forgiveness. The mess hall in that Georgia camp was eventually dismantled, the fences taken down, the land returned to quiet fields. But if you stood there on a summer morning, and the wind was just right, it was said that you could almost imagine the faint scent of butter and batter lingering in the air, like an echo of something that once mattered deeply, though few ever saw it happen. For those who lived it, the memory never faded. They remembered the warmth of the griddles, the sound of laughter returning to men who thought they'd forgotten how, and the way the sunlight touched the tables each morning as if blessing the moment. In the end, those pancakes, simple, unremarkable to anyone else, became a quiet bridge between two worlds. They reminded every man who tasted them that even in the darkest years of war, humanity has a way of resurfacing in the smallest, most ordinary acts. And perhaps that is the true legacy of that camp in Georgia. Not the fences, not the guards, not the rules, but the mornings when former enemies sat together, broke bread, and discovered, in the steam rising from their plates, the fragile beginning of peace.